And today I want to share with you a story about a specific company that's in the process of adopting continuous product discovery across their entire company. What I've found working with companies that are trying to do this is that as individual product managers, as individual designers, we can start to think about how we want to work, but if our organizations don't support it, it can be really hard. So before we jump into this story, I want to just get a feel for your guys' practice. I know you've had to raise your hands a lot. I'm going to limit this. How many of you guys have talked to one of your customers, so you individually have talked to one of your customers last week? A good amount of you. Okay, awesome. Of those of you that just raised your hands, how many of you talked to a customer the week before that? Awesome, okay, good. So this is what we're going to get into when we talk about continuous discovery. So let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you that aren't familiar with these terms, I'd like to just start at the very beginning. Continuous discovery is easiest to describe in the context of delivery. I look at discovery as the set of activities that we do as product teams to decide what to build, whereas delivery is the set of activities that we do as product teams to actually build and ship our products. Now, I want to be really clear. When I say product teams, I mean the product manager, the designers, and the software engineers. So I don't get caught up on who does what. We're a team. We're responsible for discovering value and delivering it. And so as this whole talk is going to apply to the whole team. Now, continuous discovery is a little bit more specific. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean by that. I have a very crisp definition. By continuous discovery, I mean weekly touch points with customers by the team building the product, where they themselves conduct small research activities in pursuit of a desired outcome. Now, each line of this definition is really important to me. Many of us work in companies where our customer support team talks to customers, or our centralized user research team talks to customers, but our product managers and our designers and our software engineers learn about our customers through research reports, or through personas, or through customer journey maps. I actually think it's really important for those of us that are actually building the product that we have regular interaction with our customers. Now, we aren't full-time researchers, so we can't do big box, big project research. We have to do it in small, bite-sized activities, so it fits along with all the other stuff that we do in our jobs, like writing code and designing. So we're going to talk a lot about what those small research activities look like today. And then finally, it is really important that we focus on outcomes, right? Our goal is not just to ship a product, but it's to ship a product that has an impact on our customers in a way that creates value for our business. And so we can't just do open-ended research indefinitely. Our goal should be to identify the next question that we need answered that's going to help us get to our next product outcome. So we're going to come back and talk about this quite a bit. But really, I'm here to tell you a story about a specific company. So let's get back to that tale. And I'm going to start with a little bit of context. So this is a story of a company called Arity. They're based in downtown Chicago. Arity has, actually, I just learned, 380 employees. So they're a fairly small company. But they're actually a subsidiary of a much larger company. They are in the Allstate family. So Allstate is a very large company. Earlier, someone talked about insurance. Apparently, that's going to be the theme for today. They have 40,000 plus companies or employees at Allstate. What this means is that this company, Arity, sometimes acts like a startup because they're a small company that's been protected to go and do their own thing. But they sometimes act like a big company because they grew up in the Allstate culture. And Allstate isn't just a big company. They're not a traditional tech company, right? So most people that work there don't know how digital products work. They're also a regulated industry. And if you've never worked at a bank or an insurance company or anywhere else that's regulated, what this means is the company culture is set up to be safe. It's set up to follow these regulations. And so this can lead to a lot of sign-offs, a lot of red tape. Things move pretty slowly. Now, this company builds both consumer and enterprise products. And the reason why I chose this particular company for this case study is I know I've been in your shoes where I'm sitting at a conference, I hear a speaker talk, and they tell this great story, and all I can think about is that would never work at my company, right? It's really easy to say, yeah, you guys can do that, but my place is different. What I like about Arity is there's something here for everybody, whether you're a consumer, whether you're enterprise, whether you're small, whether you're big, whether you're regulated, whether your company's on board or not. There's a lot to learn from this company's journey, so let's get into it. I want to introduce you to Frank and Gina. Frank and Gina are real people. They are 2 product managers that work at Arity. They represent 2 of the 9 product teams that I've worked with at Arity over the last year. So let's learn a little bit about their products and their journey. So Frank, I apologize, the colors are not fantastic here, but I'll walk you through it. Frank's team is working on a consumer app. So Allstate has a whole bunch of data about how you drive, where you go, your relationship with your car, and they looked at this and they said, we actually think we can provide a really compelling service to consumers to help them with all the challenges around owning a car. Their mission is that broad. Find something that you can do that's of service for consumers with their relationship to their vehicle. And this team's goal is to engage consumers through some type of app or service. Now, Frank's team, when I met with them for the first time, they were really excited about this idea of continuous discovery. They really want to build something that customers care about. There was just one problem. They had never talked to a customer before. All very smart people, all very capable, but they grew up career-wise in a company that didn't have a strong history of discovery. So we were starting from square one. And I want to emphasize that, because for those of you that don't have a regular cadence of interacting with your customers, both of the teams that we're going to talk about today were starting from scratch. Now, Frank's team in the early days was a product manager, Frank, a second product manager, Lewis, and a tech lead. I don't, unfortunately, remember the tech lead's name. Sorry, engineers. And they were supported by a centralized user research team, a centralized design team, and a centralized market insights team. And all 3 of those teams sat in Allstate, not at Arity. So there was a little bit of this divide between the product team building the product and all the design and research resources that they were supported by. This is going to be a part of our tale that we'll come back to. Gina, on the other hand, was working on a business intelligence product. You'll see in my slides that sometimes I refer to the parent company. I got permission on Friday to use the Allstate name. So that's why the slides are a little bit different from how I'm going to tell this story. So Gina works on a business intelligence product. She's actually working on, think about it as a scoring algorithm. I can't share specific details, but it's a scoring algorithm for insurance companies to help them assess risk, right? So she is much more of an enterprise B2B product, and actually what's really interesting is we'll get into this case study, not a graphical user interface product, not an app, not a website, but really a data product. It's a scoring function that's helping these companies assess risk. Think about it like a credit score, right? A credit score helps you assess risk when you're applying for a credit card or buying a home. Okay, so like Frank's team, Gina's team was also sold on this idea of continuous discovery, but they had talked to customers, but only in a sales context. And their goal was to find their first referenceable customer for their scoring product. And Gina had a tech lead and a data analyst on her team, and she was supported, because she was working in the insurance industry, she was supported by both the president of Arity, who had worked at Allstate for a long time and had a lot of industry connections, and she was also supported, obviously, by Allstate and everything they know about the insurance business. Okay, so remember, our goal is to get Frank and Gina to have weekly touch points with their customers so that they themselves can conduct small research activities, learn very quickly in pursuit of their desired outcome. So let's talk a little bit about how this went. The first thing is we need to get them doing small research activities on a regular basis. So we started by looking at this set of activities. How can they do regular customer interviews, rapid prototyping, and product experiments? They were doing none of this when we started. So we started with customer interviews. How can we get them learning about their customers? So Frank, at this point, if you remember in my description of his team, they had never talked to a customer before. They did know they were supported by a centralized user research team. So they did what most people would do, and they reached out to that team and they asked for help. And they said, hey, we're working with Teresa. She's a little bit crazy. She wants us to talk to a customer every week. Help. How do we do that? And they ran into a couple of problems. First of all, their central research team said, great, we do this for a living. We can help. They wanted to schedule 6 interviews for 3 weeks out. Now let's think about this from their perspective. They're a centralized research team. They support dozens and dozens of product teams across both Arity and Allstate. They've got a pipeline of projects that they have to get through. So when a team comes to them and says, I need to talk to customers, they have to get in line. They also work on this big project mindset. You can't just talk to one customer, you got to talk to 6 to 12 customers, right? That's what we mean by research. Well, this team got stuck because they came and told me this, and I said, this isn't how it works. I want you to talk to one customer this week. I don't care how you do it, just find somebody to talk to. Now, here's the good news. Frank's team, so I told Frank's team this, and they were a little bit concerned. They were like, we can talk to people, but are we allowed to? We don't want to step on our user research team's toes. That we know they can help us. Why can't we just wait? And I said, because you don't make product decisions every 3 weeks. You make product decisions every day. You need to move your product forward every day. And if we want to co-create with our customers, we need to make sure that the teams building the product are interacting with them on a regular basis. So the good news is, I said, look, we can let your user research team schedule those 6 interviews 3 weeks out. In the meantime, let's just start talking to people. You're working on a consumer product. Get outside, talk to people. Let's see what we can learn. And I introduced them to this idea that I call research in the wild. So when we think about research, we think about formal, hour-long discussions with long discussion guides where somebody's vetted every question, research, right? Big research. I said, look, you've never talked to a customer. You're trying to build a product for people about how they interact with their cars. Let's just go talk to people and see what they want and see what they think. Now, here's the danger in this. Most product teams hear that, and they go, here's my cool idea. What do you think? And they don't get very good feedback. So I sent this team out, and I said, I want you to talk to your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors, the barista at Starbucks, and I want you to ask them one question. Tell me about your experience with your car. That's it. And I want you to listen to how they respond to that question. It was intentionally broad. And it's because how people answer that question tells you, gives you hints as to their mental model of how they think about their vehicle. What's important to them? What's the most salient thing that comes up? Then from there, I just want you to have a conversation. It can last 5 minutes, it can last 10 minutes, it can last an hour if they want to talk to you that long. But your goal is just to get out there and talk to people. So they did this. They did it multiple times in a week. And within 1 week, they went from having never talked to a customer to talking to almost a dozen customers. And they started collecting these really, excuse me. I lost my voice over the weekend. So this is going to be interesting. So in 1 week, they went from having never talked to a customer to talking to dozens and collecting a bunch of valuable stories. And a lot of what they heard aligned with what they were thinking, but they also heard a lot of new things. And there was a lot of things they were thinking that they didn't hear anything about. So right away, just starting this regular cadence, they started to learn a ton and were able to iterate on their ideas. Now, 3 weeks went by, and their user research team had set up great interviews, and they did those interviews, and they learned a lot from those interviews too. But the other thing they did was they started sharing with their user research team some of the things that they were learning in their research in the wild interviews. And their research team got really excited about this. They wanted to do those interviews too. And eventually we started to converge our methods. The research team started to recruit 1 to 2 formal interviews every week. And both Frank's team and the research team started doing all these ad hoc interviews, all these ad hoc conversations. And the rate of learning on this team went way up. Okay. Now, like I said, I've been a skeptical audience member. So if you work on an enterprise product, I'm sure what you're thinking is, great, this works in the consumer world. How in the world does this work in a B2B world? So that's where we're going to talk about Gina. So if you remember, Gina is working on a business intelligence product, a scoring function to help insurance companies remove risk. Gina can't go out and talk to friends and family. She has to talk to companies. And more specifically, she needs to talk to small insurance firms. So research in the wild isn't exactly going to work for her. Now, she did have a huge advantage. She works at a very large insurance company that has a lot of relationships in our industry. And she was able to leverage those inside connections. So she set up her first couple of weeks of interviews by going to her president and saying, hey, do you know someone at this insurance company? What about this other insurance company? This, however, is not a long-term solution, right? If her goal is to do one customer interview every week, eventually she's going to run out of connections. So she also spent time using a service that she paid to recruit participants for her. This was a good supplement, so she did both at the exact same time to make sure that she was able to have a consistent cadence of interviews. And as she talked to those folks, they got interested in her idea. And eventually, they wanted to learn more. They became part of her sales pipeline. If anybody's ever sold before, you know you don't just talk to one person at the company. So instead of doing interviews with just the one person she was introduced to, suddenly she was meeting all the key roles that might be involved in a sale. And she asked all of them, hey, who else should I be talking to? And over time, she too built up this regular cadence of customer interviews. Now, if you're in a startup or you're launching a product in an industry you haven't worked before, you may not have these inside connections to take advantage of, but we all can pay a service to recruit for us. Now, that can be really expensive, but we're going to talk about that in just a second. So let's back up and ask, what can we learn from Frank and Gina's experiences? The first thing, and I teach all of my teams this, is that you have to try lots of ways to recruit, right? What works for one company might not work for you. What worked for Frank didn't work for Gina. But the goal is we want to try lots and lots of ways until we can find something that works. If you have a consumer site, one of the best ways to recruit interview participants is to use something like Ethnio to pop up a one-question screener. Are you available to talk to us on Thursday at 10 a.m. for 30 minutes? We'll give you a $30 Amazon gift card. Turns out, when you turn that on, you get interview participants in 4 minutes. Really fast. You can turn it off. Your week's full, right? So again, every company is different. If you're on the enterprise side and you really don't have any connections and you're struggling to pay to recruit, you can set up customer support triggers where you tell your customer support team, when this happens, send that person my way. I want to interview them. So the key here, you have to try a lot of things. When you find something that works, you want to automate it. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to wake up on Monday morning, you show up to work, you look at your calendar, and later in the week, you have a customer interview on your calendar, and you did absolutely nothing to make that happen. That's awesome, right? This is how we interview customers more often than not, right? We need to automate the process. So Frank was able to do this because he had a centralized user research team that worked with him. They had a long history of recruiting people. But they started using tools like Ethnio and Usabilla to recruit directly from the people using their product. And Gina eventually, as her product grew, she got help from a sales rep, and her sales rep was out in the field, and she started coming up with sales rep triggers, just like I talked about customer support triggers, so that she always had something on her calendar every week without her doing anything. This is what makes continuous sustainable. Finally, actually, I think there's 2 more. The third thing is you need to do your own research, right? So the reason for this is every week you're going to have different questions. And our goal with continuous discovery is each week to learn the different nuances of our very specific research questions. This is too much detail for a centralized user research team unless they're embedded with you and they know your product and they know your context. So that's great. If you have an embedded researcher on your team, use them. If you don't, you need to learn how to do some of this yourself. And here's the great thing. Use your centralized researchers as research experts. They can help you improve your research methods. Finally, especially in the early days of setting up continuous interviews, you have to do things that don't scale. Now, this was in our earlier talk. I'm glad to see it. This is something, I think doing things that don't scale is the secret to success. We worry too much about the 1,000th person when we really should be focusing on the first, second, and third people. So as you're trying to get to a point where you're integrating regular interviews, I don't want you to worry about, oh, well, this guy only knows 3 people. Who do I talk to in week 4? Start by talking to those 3 people. Because when we do things that don't scale over and over again, we find ways to scale them. Okay, so at this point, Gina and Frank are both doing regular customer interviews. So we've moved on. It's time to do some rapid prototyping. Now, Frank, his team at this point already had concept designs. So if you remember, they don't have a designer on their team. They worked with their centralized design team to do concept designs. That had happened like the month prior. But they hadn't gotten any feedback on these designs. So the first thing they had to do was integrate rapid prototyping into their customer interviews. Now what's great is when you already have an interview on your calendar every week, you can use half of your interview to do what you've always been doing, which is your generative interviews, and you can use the other half to test a couple prototypes. So because Frank's team already had designs, they just started by using their concept designs. This was fairly easy for them to do. But they quickly ran into a problem. They did most of their interviews virtually because they were based in Chicago and they were worried about just focusing on Chicago needs. They wanted to talk to people that lived all over the US. They didn't actually know how to prototype test virtually. So their first hurdle was they had to learn new digital tools. Now what's great is we have a ton of remote prototype testing tools, whether it's usertesting.com or Validately or a dozen more. This team had never used one of those tools. They quickly learned it. They started doing all of their prototypes virtually. This was actually their easiest hurdle. The next one was, once you start doing a whole bunch of interviews every week and your prototype testing every week, you learn what isn't working in your design. And you need to change your design. Because if you don't, in week 3, all you learn is the same thing you learned in week 2. And there's no point in continuously learning. So this team had to learn how to iterate really quickly on their prototypes. And the challenge here is they didn't have a designer embedded on the team. And this is a classic example where even if this team wants to do continuous discovery, if their organization doesn't support it, they're going to have a hard time. So I was able to help them with this. I went back to their leaders and I said, this team needs a designer. But before they got a designer, the product managers went in and got their hands dirty. They started to learn how to do simple prototypes, not full-blown, beautiful, pixel-perfect designs, but they were able to prototype whiteboard, use Balsamiq, simple prototypes that allowed them to iterate on what they were learning from their customers week over week, so that every week their product got better. Okay, so again, easy to think about. We think about product prototypes as mock-ups, right? So this all makes sense to us. What about Gina? Gina's working on a scoring function. What does a prototype look like in that world? It's easy to think about prototypes as mock-ups, but they're not. They're not just that. The goal of a prototype is to collect qualitative feedback on our ideas. And Gina had a big idea that she needed qualitative feedback on. So instead of doing mock-ups because her product had no graphical user interface, she stepped back and she said, what do I need feedback on? And she realized what she needed feedback on was her concept. Like, are we approaching the scoring function the right way? Is this how insurance companies think about what we're doing? So she started by building a pitch deck. Her product didn't exist yet, but she put together a pitch deck as if it did. And she used her pitch deck as her prototype. And in all of her customer interviews and in all of her sales conversations, she started to pitch this idea. And she got feedback. Some people liked it, some people didn't. She iterated on her pitch deck. She didn't let her engineers build anything until she got to a pitch deck that insurance companies were excited about. And then she didn't stop there, because pitch decks tend to be high-level benefits, concepts, and she knew that wasn't enough to validate her ideas. So she moved to what we call what-if scenarios. So she started to define really specific scenarios around how an insurance company would use her scoring function. And she got really specific. And she went out to back to her same customers and she said, okay, you loved our concept. Here's how we think you'll use it in one of these 3 or 4 ways. This was invaluable to her. She actually learned really quickly that the way she was thinking about the product was radically different from the way her customers were. All of her what-if scenarios were wrong to start. Even though her background was insurance, she'd been working at Allstate, and she was working with Allstate people to develop the product idea. But Allstate is a really large insurance company, and her customers were small insurance companies. She very quickly realized they have different abilities, they have different needs. So she was able to make a ton of progress just by iterating through what-if scenarios before she even had a product. So again, what can we learn from Frank and Gina about prototyping? First is we want to start with low fidelity, right? If we're going to learn every week, we need our designs to change every week. We need our prototype to change every week. So Frank started with really pixel-perfect, high-level concept designs, but they quickly moved to balsamic designs because that's what the product managers could learn quickly and iterate on quickly to get feedback. Gina started with a pitch deck, easy to change a PowerPoint, and did it every week, every conversation they both iterated. They both had to make sure that the people on their team had prototyping skills. They had to pick mediums that they knew how to create in. So in the case of our product managers on Frank's team, they weren't designers. They don't know how to use these big Adobe design tools. They picked something really easy. Honestly, they started on a whiteboard with a marker with a customer in the room. And when they moved virtual, they started to learn how to use balsamic. Gina obviously used PowerPoint and used PowerPoint to walk through different what-if scenarios. The other thing I want to leave you with is that prototypes come in all different shapes and sizes. They're not just mock-ups of a GUI, right? So I've seen teams prototype just by role-playing, having someone on the product team role-play with the customer. We've seen Wizard of Oz experiments where some people behind the scenes are acting like the software. Lots of ways to prototype. The key question to ask is, how can I get qualitative feedback on my idea? Okay, so both these teams are at a point where they're doing regular customer interviews, they're doing a regular prototype test, and by regular, I mean every week. This was a team that at the beginning had never talked to a customer. Both of them now, every week talking to customers, every week rapid prototyping. So it's time to introduce product experiments. Now, this word gets thrown around a lot in the industry, so I want to be really clear what I mean by an experiment. An experiment starts with a prediction or a hypothesis. We put a stake in the ground and we say, this is what we think is going to happen, and then we design something that is meant to test that prediction. So Frank's team, when I said it's time to start experimenting, they thought, oh, we already have an experiment in flight. And I said, oh, you do? What's that? And they said, well, we're running this 6-month pilot with 200,000 Allstate customers. I said, okay, when did that start? And they go, oh, it's starting in November. This was May of last year. I said, okay, that's great. Run your pilot. You got all your sign-off. You went through your red tape. Your pilot's running. I want to learn something in the next 6 months. So we need a faster experiment, right? So with Frank's team, I introduced On Frank's team, I introduced the idea of landing page tests. Their product was actually pretty sophisticated. They wanted to help you out when your check engine light came on and help you understand what it meant and where you could get service. The problem with that is your check engine light doesn't come on every week, right? So finding an audience that we can test with where this is actually going to happen is surprisingly hard, which is why they set up a 6-month pilot with 200,000 customers. Because they knew that at least in that 6-month window, some of those 200,000 people would have their check engine light come on. But it's not a good way to learn. So we introduced this idea of landing page tests where they could at least build a landing page that says, hey, we'll help you when your check engine light comes on. The problem is landing page tests scared the daylights out of this team. Let me remind you, they worked at Allstate. There was concerns from their marketing team. Is it going to hurt our brand? You can't put Allstate on it. The marketing team was like, oh, we have a search engine marketing team. Like, let's get them involved. And I was like, whoa, no, we're not doing this. The product team themselves were like, I don't even know how to build a landing page. And Teresa, you already know we don't have a designer. We're prototyping on a whiteboard. How are we going to do a landing page test? Well, here's the thing. This team was awesome. Because even though they were terrified and they had a million reasons not to do this, we just picked them apart one by one. We invited people from the Allstate marketing team to come to our coaching sessions. We explained to them what we were doing. We explained to them why it wasn't the same as search engine marketing. We told them we wouldn't use the Allstate brand. We didn't even use the Arity brand. We used a product brand no one's ever heard of, and we launched a landing page. And by the way, the product manager went out and found Wix as a tool And he created landing pages in Wix, which gave him A/B testing right out of the box. The other product manager learned how to set up Google Ads, how to drive traffic to that landing page. This team had never done anything like this before. But because they worked through all of those obstacles, they learned so much in a fraction of time. They didn't wait 6 months to get their first feedback on their product idea. Every week, they were able to tweak their landing page tests and run another set. And they did all kinds of things. They played with value propositions. They played with messaging. They played with different feature sets. And they learned, by adding this to their interviews and their rapid prototypes and their landing page tests, they were able to learn faster in 3 weeks than they had in the 6 months before this. This was one of the most awesome stories to watch happen. Okay, again, enterprise folks in the room, we can't do landing page tests. I get it. Let's come back to Gina. So Gina, landing page tests weren't going to work. She already knew that people were excited about her concept. She learned that from her pitch decks. And she already knew that she was working through the what-if scenario. She knew what her product needed to do. With experiments, our goal is to remove risk. Her risk wasn't, do people want it? And by this point, it also wasn't, do we know how they want to use it? Her risk was, can we do it? So scoring functions are not easy, right? Google makes $1 bajillion for a reason. They've got a really good algorithm. So for Gina, her product experiments had to really be focused on feasibility. And this is where she had to work with her data analyst, and they had to come up with their own predictions. This is how we think this is what we think our scoring function is going to predict. And they had to run their own experiments to make sure that happened. This was started a year ago, so we're a year into this process. They've run enough experiments that they now have a set of what-if scenarios they know they can deliver on, and they're selling. And they have a whole nother set of what-if scenarios that they know their customers need, that they're still trying to figure out how to algorithmically deliver on. So in Gina's case, her product experiments are not A/B tests with consumers. They're much more number-crunching data analysts, feasibility tests. Now, we see the same thing with engineering problems, right? We often have really cool ideas, but we don't know if they're technically feasible. So Gina all of her experimenting was really focused on feasibility. Okay, so let's back up. Let's look at Gina and Frank. What can we learn? The first thing I want to leave you with is chip away at those obstacles, right? Frank's team was faced with a mountain of obstacles when it came to running a landing page test. The first time I suggested it to them, they all said almost in unison, that would never work here. What I left out of the story was once they ran a successful landing page test and they shared it with everybody else in the organization, everybody started doing landing page tests. It spread like wildfire. Now, some of them weren't using them quite correctly, and they had to come to coaching and learn how to do them better. But here's the thing. They all got excited about a tool. It allowed them to learn every week because Frank's team was willing to chip away at the obstacles. Second of all, especially when you're looking at experiments, it's easy to think about experiments as large-scale pilots where we're testing the whole product idea. It's not what we want to do. We want to design our experiments so that they allow us to learn fast. I don't want to wait till November. I want to know, what can I learn this week? And that's a really powerful question. I get my teams to ask, what can we learn today and what can we learn this week to really accelerate the pace? One of the best ways to make your experiments smaller is to test specific assumptions. So don't test the whole product idea. Identify the piece that's riskiest. So in this case, Frank's whole product wasn't risky. The first step was, will anybody even download our app? A landing page test is great for testing that. And then again, just like we saw with prototypes, product experiments come in all shapes and sizes. Risk shows up in many forms. We have risk around desirability. Does anybody want it? We have risk around feasibility. Can we even build it? And we have risk around viability. Is there a market for it? Can we make money from it? Does it support our business? As product teams, we need to run experiments on all three of these dimensions. Okay, so Frank and Gina have gone on this long journey where they're iterating every week, they're talking to their customers, they're prototyping, they're running experiments. What did they get from all of this? What happens when you interview, prototype, test, and experiment every week? You get fast answers to that week's questions from multiple research activities. Now, this is really important. We literally make product decisions every single day. We don't want them to be guesses. And we also don't want to just use one research activity. I can't tell you how many times both Frank and Gina would hear something in an interview and get a conflicting result in a landing page test. Now, they could have just gone with what they heard in the interview, or they could have just gone with what they learned in the landing page test. But because they conflicted, what it meant was there's more to learn here. And they were able to dig in and say, why is there a difference? And that led to a new research question, which they could use the following week's activities to get an answer to. So setting up this infrastructure where these activities are already on your calendar makes it really easy to get fast answers. And when you can get fast answers, you stop guessing and you start learning. And this is how we get to really good products. So I want to encourage all of you to start thinking about how can you talk to customers every week, how can you prototype every week, and how can you run good product experiments every week. Thank you.